it left me with a kind of continuous research, always not accepting, always looking, always saying there's another way, or there's a new way to interpret these things. That kind of thinking was imbued in my life anyway, from the beginning. And so it works in architecture to be curious, to explore, to never give up. And that's, it's kind of like that.
So many people have, and tell us their thoughts about what they think about Frank Gehry's architecture. But I'm interested in you, Frank Gehry, about your architecture as sort of a canon. What do you think of it when you look at your buildings, when you see them as a piece? What do you think?
Well, I don't think of them as an ego trip, which is what you're suggesting. It's not. It's not about that. So one of my professors at SC took me aside once, just privately, and he said, "Frank, you're going to do good, but I want you to promise me no matter what you do, you're going to deliver. If you got a budget, you're going to deliver. Whatever, you got to deliver." So that mantra has been in my life, and but it is because I took that seriously, and you can do it. It's not like everything has to go over budget. Bilbao was $100 million budget. I did it for $97 million. So
yeah. It's a beautiful.
Walt Disney Concert Hall was 207 budget, 207 delivered.
And as you say, your kind of mantra is deliver, and you do. And it brings me back to Forma, because in 2014, the Toronto Star wrote an article that city officials had reacted with fear and loathing with your initial proposal was brought forward, that the city planner at the time talked about the project being too dense, too tall, all those things. You ended up addressing all those concerns. But what does that initial reaction say to you, and maybe our cultural way of thinking when it comes to bold buildings?
Well, people are scared of what they don't understand. I think people are afraid. It's taken a long time for clients to understand that I do deliver, and they come after me because of that. But I bring value and deliver. So that's what we're supposed to do. It's my job. So, and Canada is special to me.
As your love for Canada is very clear, let's talk about our architecture. I think, and feel free to argue with me, that Toronto, and I think even Canada, is not really known for its architecture. How would you describe the aesthetic in our country as it relates to our architecture?
Well, if you look at all the towers built in Toronto, it's like everything else in the world. So I don't think they're any different right now. Somebody let the dogs loose. I tried to do work with a developer in Vancouver. No respect for architecture, just total money deal. So I couldn't do it. I think that's the disease, is that it is about money. And money rules the world. So to find out you can make a beautiful building for the same money and make more money because it's a beautiful building, they're kind of slow to get a hold of. They're starting to get it, but that's worldwide.
Yeah, there's also, as you know, and this is true of many big cities, Toronto included, that there are concerns by many about condo developments, that neighborhoods are increasingly being stripped of their identities as these condos go up. And given what you just said, what do you make of that skepticism around condos?
Well, I think somebody has to have a bigger picture, and apparently there isn't that interest in the political arena, and people that are running your mayors, whatever, they have to make it something that priority is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, priority.
Yeah, but it doesn't exist, so what the hell?
So how do you convince people that design and that architecture helps foster, as you have said, community?
It's profitable. The developers I work with love what I do because it's profitable. If they understand that, if you make a beautiful piece of sculpture, somebody buys it. If it looks like same old, so you get same old. I think we're all subject to that kind of idiocy. Single-handed, nobody's going to be able to do it. We have to come together and talk about it. I mean, just giving little awards here and there, it's not enough.
You have had such a long and illustrious career. You're still in high demand. You have lots of projects on the go. And a couple of years back, you told the New York Times that, quote, "The ideas are coming to me at fast speed. I can't even keep up with them. I guess I'm trying to get everything done before I leave the earth." And so, Frank Gehry, where do you keep finding the inspiration, the energy, the demands that all of this takes?
With the people I work with. There's a great art world out there that's very inspirational. There's a great music world that's very inspirational. There's a lot of inspiration for me from my colleagues in the art world, from the artists past and present, from musicians. There's a lot of inspiration.
Well, I look forward to seeing Forma come to life, and I appreciate you making time for us today.
It's being done with a lot of love for Toronto, I promise you that.
We appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Frank Gehry. Take care.
Thank you.
Well, as you heard, Frank Gehry mentioned how music has been an inspiration for him throughout his life and work, particularly Glenn Gould's version of Bach's Goldberg Variations. So here is Glenn Gould and the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, led by conductor Ernest Macmillan, with some of the first movement from Bach's Concerto in D minor. First movement from Bach's Concerto in D minor. Now, before we put the Sunday magazine to bed for today, I would like to recite you a story. Okay. In the Great Green Room, there was a telephone, and a red balloon, and a picture of... And now I am going to bet that many of you know the next line by heart, and maybe even the whole book. Because for millions, the opening words of Goodnight Moon are etched deep in childhood memories. The children's picture book was published 75 years ago this month, and it has earned a reputation as a classic of the genre. But that took time. Its author, New York's Margaret Wise Brown, had a vision for what kids wanted, but her work wasn't widely celebrated during her life. And yet, Goodnight Moon has endured, selling more than 40 million copies. Heck, the New Yorker recently described it as a modernist work of art. But that's probably not the kind of language Margaret Wise Brown would have used.
She was not full of herself. Sorry, but I'm being honest with you. I'm Leonard Marcus. I'm a children's book historian and the author of Margaret Wise Brown, Awakened by the Moon. Margaret Wise Brown was glamorous, she was adventurous, she was very much a modern, independent woman. She said she didn't like comfort, she liked luxury. She could be a wonderful friend, and I interviewed about 100 people who knew her well, and almost every single one of them said she was the most important person in their life. She died at the age of 42 of a blood clot following an operation, so she was never an old woman. She was never the old lady whispering hush, which is what some people imagine. Well, she was a poet by temperament, but she landed pretty much by chance at the Bank Street College of Education as a student teacher, and that turned out to be the best place she could have landed because the training there was all about learning by doing. So that meant that rather than read a textbook about children's literature, you would write stories for the children at the nursery school, which was also part of Bank Street, and see how they went over. And that way you would learn what children really care about.
Good night, kittens. Good night, mittens. Good night, clocks, and good night, socks.
It turned out that she was really great at it. Her goal at that point had not been to write for children, it had been to write for the New Yorker, but they kept projecting her stories because she wasn't really good at writing about her peers. But it turned out she had a direct line to children at 2 and 3 and 4 years old.
Good night, nobody. Good night, nobody. Good night, boss.
She had a deep memory of what it was like to be that kind of person herself, and was able to shape her words in a way that would be funny and moving and emotionally real for young children.
Good night, stars, and a good night air. Good night noises everywhere.
It's not a traditional narrative. In that sense, it relates to experimental writing of the 20th century. She was very influenced by Gertrude Stein, and the artwork is influenced by Fauvism. The illustrator Clement Hurd had spent time in France with those painters, and it was inspired by the understanding of young children that they are sensory learners, so intense colors appeal to them in a very direct and immediate way. Almost nobody was writing for children that young at that time. The libraries, which were the main place where children's books were purchased and made available to the public in the 1930s and 40s, didn't want children who were too young to sign their name in a guest book. So 2 and 3-year-olds were just not on the table for the libraries, and that meant the publishers weren't that interested in making books for the younger children either. The library philosophy really was rooted in a sense of the importance of protecting children from the harsher realities of life. And she and her friends and teachers and colleagues at Bank Street were totally opposed to that point of view. They thought it was sentimental, and they thought it was unworthy of children. I mean, part of what made her work special was the emotional truthfulness of it. Well, her parents were well off, but not happy. They eventually got divorced. I think she remembered the shouting and the anger at home, and I can't help but think, this is speculation, but it makes so much sense to me, that the line, "Goodnight noises everywhere," is an echo of the lack of quiet that she may have experienced as a child. And it's been said more than once by people who knew her or were around her that Goodnight Moon was her way of making the world better for other children than it had been for herself. Children's books were viewed as second-rate in terms of artistic achievement in general. I mean, even co-founder of Random House, Bennett Cerf, who she was a social friend of, referred to her books sort of derisively as baby books. That's a lot of pressure to stand up against. When you're a pioneer, you often don't have a chance to see everyone recognize what you've achieved, and she had some recognition, but not nearly as much as she would have had she lived on into our time. But I think in the long run, she did appreciate herself as a writer, and what I found in her last 2 years of life was a really clear, growing sense of self-worth and self-appreciation. I think it was the best time of her life, actually. Yeah, she wrote a book called Mr. Dog, which is subtitled The Dog Who Belonged to Himself. If you think about that, that's a story of self-possession, and that's where she was in her life.
Children's book historian Leonard Marcus reflecting the life and the work of Margaret Wise Brown. Her kids' classic, Goodnight Moon, turns 75 years young this month. And with that, the sun has set on this round of the Sunday magazine. Our producers are Sarah Joyce Battersby, Tracy Fuller, Levi Garber, Andrew Huang, Pete Mitten, Aronde Williams, and Samarwee Johannes. We had additional help this week from Gabby Hagarillas. Our senior producer is Brian Coulton. Our executive producer is Donna Dingwall. If you want to hear or share any or all of today's stories, you can stream them at cbc.ca/Sunday. It's also one of the many places you can get our podcast. Be sure to join us once again next Sunday when I will sit down with Moses Neimer, 50 years after the Canadian media mogul launched Toronto's first independent TV station, City TV. I'm Pia Chattopadhyay. Thank you for lending us your ear. Till next Sunday.
This is CBC Radio 1, 89.1 FM in Waterloo Region. A battle on the ice. Two rivals.
Players from Boston, Montreal, Detroit, Philadelphia.
And you had the Soviet team. These guys lived and breathed hockey.
8 games. Everything at stake.
That was the greatest thing ever happened to the game. It changed hockey for the better.
Summit 72, September 14th at 8 on CBC. Stream free on CBC Gem. The CBC News is next, and then it's What on Earth with Laura Lynch.
The world has shown it can come together to solve serious environmental challenges, but it's also shown the gulf that still needs to be bridged when it comes to helping countries like Pakistan confront climate change disasters. Both stories this week.
This is CBC News. From CBC Toronto, here's the news at 11 o'clock. Right now it's 21 and cloudy in the city. Good morning. I'm Kate McGilfrey. In the U.S.
Brenda C. Gibson. Colonel Ronald F. Golinsky, United States Army, retired.
A bell tolls as the name of each victim of the 9/11 attacks is read out. It's been 21 years since the deadliest attack on U.S. soil. Ceremonies are being held in New York, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the sites where the hijacked planes crashed. Other communities around the country are marking the day with candlelight vigils, interfaith services, and other commemorations. The attack on September 11, 2001 killed nearly 3,000 people and led to the U.S. global war on terror. Queen Elizabeth's hearse is set to arrive in Edinburgh this hour after travelling from Balmoral, her Scottish estate. Emotions ran high for some as her hearse passed slowly through the towns along the route. Pauline Lawson lives in Ballater, not far from the castle.
Oh, it's been such an incredibly sad week, knowing the Queen has passed. But, you know, she's been such a good Queen to us all. You know, she's been loyal, she's been dignified, she's been kind and compassionate. Everything you'd want from a monarch.
The Queen's coffin will be flown to London to lie in state before her funeral, which will take place on September 19th. Queen Elizabeth died on Thursday at the age of 96. And while many people in Britain are mourning her, for others, the relationship with the monarchy is uneasy, as it includes the dark shadow of slavery. London has a large Jamaican community, which includes descendants of those who moved to England after the Second World War to help rebuild the country. CBC reporter Briar Stewart has that story.
At a hall in South London which honours veterans from the West Indies, dozens of people sit at tables playing dominoes. On the walls are pictures of soldiers along with a portrait of the Queen. Saffron Blue sits underneath it.
A remarkable woman.
Blue moved to London from Jamaica when she was a child. She thinks King Charles will do a fine job, but she doesn't expect him to do anything more to address the monarchy's colonial history.
It's all part and parcel of who they are.
William Henry is a professor of criminology and sociology at the University of West London and has African and Jamaican ancestry.
There are people in Jamaica who can't even afford to have running water. That's always the monarchy done for them.
But back at the Veterans Hall, many say they were fond of the Queen, but really like her grandson, Prince Harry.
Harry married a black woman. I will love him for that.
Briar Stewart, CBC News, London.
Now to local news, there's been a string of shootings in Toronto this weekend. A 15-year-old boy was killed yesterday, and this morning alone, 4 people were injured in 3 separate shootings. One was in the West End near Lansdowne and Bloor, one downtown near University in Adelaide, and a third in Etobicoke near Royal York and Eglinton. Some GO passengers who were stuck on a train for hours this weekend have some questions for Metrolinx. After a fatality on the tracks Friday night, people waited for 4 hours to get off. They say Metrolinx was not communicative enough about what was happening, and one passenger described a fellow passenger fainting from dehydration. A Metrolinx rep told the CBC they did issue an advisory about the situation and said safety is their top priority. Read more at cbc.ca/Toronto. And finally, Toronto's International Film Festival has begun. Yesterday, a documentary about late actor and activist Sidney Poitier premiered. He was the first black actor to win the Best Actor at the Oscars. Director Reginald Hudlin said the world needs this film right now.
He taught people how to beat the odds, and that's what we want people to see. So wherever your situation is, if you're like, oh, I'm an immigrant and this country's hostile to me, or I'm a person of color, or I'm repressed, or I'm an artist and I'm trying to find my voice, no matter where you're coming from, Sydney will teach you a lesson for you to go to the next level.
TIFF runs until September 18th. That's your CBC News for 11 o'clock. I'm Kate McGilfrey. Here's the weather forecast for London today. Partly cloudy, clouding over more later in the day. The high is 24, feeling more like 29. Overnight, a few possible showers with a low of 18. Those showers continuing on Monday, high on Monday, 22. And for Kitchener-Waterloo, a mainly cloudy Sunday in store. The high is 24, feeling more like 29. Overnight, chance of showers, low of 17. Possible showers Monday as well, a high of 21 degrees, feeling hotter with the Humidex.
The world was told it was a threat. People were urged to pay attention to the science. Change your ways, your behavior, in order to protect the future. I'm not talking about today, and not even really about climate change. I'm revisiting the days decades ago when the ozone layer was thinning, holes opening up. But back then, the world did come together. The threat was met with solidarity and action.